Welcome to Together Women Rise's monthly webinar. A special welcome to anyone joining us tonight who's new to these webinars and Together Women Rise. Please reach out on the chat function to introduce yourself and let us know if you'd like to learn more about our Rise community. My name is Scott Osborne. I'm a volunteer member of the Together Women Rise's Grants and Partnership Committee. I serve as chair of the Transformation Partnerships Working Group, and I'll be moderating tonight. Before we get started, a couple of just quick Zoom reminders. Please keep yourself on mute so we don't have those background noises. If you like, enable the closed captioning function, and you'll find this on your Zoom toolbar, probably at the bottom of your screen. You might want to look at the speaker view rather than gallery and see who's talking. On the Zoom toolbar, you'll also find that chat function. So use this. Tell us where you're from, ask questions. We will have time for an attendee Q&A a little later in the program. Now, to introduce our partner. It's time to learn about that program. At these monthly webinars, you have an opportunity to learn more about the challenges and issues faced by the women and girls that together we help fund in low-income and marginalized countries in the Global South. I want to talk just a little bit about the Global South. I talked about this a little bit last month, but it's a term that's not familiar to everyone. It sounds like a geographic term, a specific part of the globe, but it's really more than that. It's really an economic term. Countries in the Global South generally experience higher levels of poverty, income inequality, they have lower life expectancy, and let's just say generally harsher living conditions compared to wealthier nations in what's called the Global North. And that's those of us in North America or Europe and even Japan. The Global South includes those countries that were once called developing or less developed or underdeveloped. And those are terms that are really no longer used when we talk about global economies. So we work in the Global South to help women and girls, and our overall mission is to achieve global gender equality. Our grants and partnership program uses multiple approaches to accomplish this. As you all, I hope, know, our featured grants are largely focused on delivering direct services. They fund grassroots organizations that support women and girls in this Global South by providing a wide range of incredibly valuable inputs. But our transformation partnerships are designed to address the root causes of gender inequality, the systemic issues kind of behind the scenes. Both approaches are really crucial. We want to help women and girls, but we can't reach gender equality by funding direct services alone. That inequality is too deeply rooted in norms and beliefs and practices and laws. We might just fund generation after generation for the same things. So these transformation partnerships are really needed to address the systems that hold women back and prevent them from having equal access to the opportunities and decision-making power that they're entitled to. So this month, we're highlighting one of Together Women Rise's transformation partnerships, Equality Now. In 2023, we awarded Equality Now a 2-year grant of $100,000 per year for 2023 and 24. That grant is to support their work on legal gender equality and ending harmful practices and sexual violence. We're very pleased to have with us tonight 3 representatives from Equality Now, Amy Hutchinson, Tamara Dekanodze, and Star Miller. They're going to tell us more about this program. But first, let's take a few minutes to watch this short video. Greetings. My name is Scott Osborne, and I'm volunteer chair of the Transformation Partnerships Committee. This month, we're delighted to be highlighting another one of our transformation partners. Most of you know we began awarding these transformation grants in December of 2022. These grants address the root causes of gender inequality, the underlying systemic issues, often the ones it's hard to see. Transformation partnerships are necessary because we cannot reach gender equality just by funding direct services. The inequality is too deeply rooted in social and cultural norms and beliefs and laws. So we believe both approaches we take are crucial, funding direct services through our featured grants and funding systems change through our transformation partnerships. Putting those two together is a seamless way to have more impact. Tonight's transformation partner is Equality Now, an organization that uses the law to help women and girls. We gave them a grant for $100,000 per year for 2 years. Equality Now has been around for over 30 years, and they have offices on 4 continents. But what they really do is work with local partners, 147 of them in 34 countries. They're able to take their resources and really leverage it around the world. I've said their work is legal justice, so let's look a little bit about what that means. Unless you're a lawyer, you might not have thought much about how legal reform changes our lives. But for example, in the US, The first state to pass a law permitting women to keep their own property was in 1848. It wasn't until the 1920s that every state passed this. But around the world, 40% of countries limit women's property rights. Women cannot necessarily keep property in their own name before or after marriage. And in the US, the Equal Pay Act, that was passed in 1964. It required companies to pay women the same as men. But around the world, 19 countries require women to have their husband's permission just to work outside the home. And the US Pregnancy Discrimination Act of 1978, quite recently, banned sex discrimination against pregnant women. But around the world, in 41 countries, employers can legally dismiss pregnant workers just for being pregnant. Think how that would affect employment choices. These are just a few examples of how laws have changed lives. Women's private lives, their property, their health, their wealth, their marriages, all their rights are affected. Our lives are radically changed by our legal system. So if we truly want gender equality, we need to help other women on their paths to legal reform. And that's why Equality Now, whose entire mission is to help women have an equal legal footing, does such important work. Their motto is a just world for women and girls, and we couldn't agree more. We look forward to hearing more from Equality Now. And while you're learning about that, be on the lookout this month for the announcement of this year's new featured grants. Thank you. I noticed a few people said their audio was gapping there, so our apologies, but we're going to have our speakers give you all the information. So let's turn to them now. Amy Hutchinson is Equality Now's Global Director of Development, and those of us on the committee have had the privilege of talking and meeting with her many times in preparation for these grants. Amy helps shape organizational strategy, and she leads Equality Now's fundraising efforts. She's worked at the intersection of human rights, social justice, and philanthropy for more than 2 decades. She was also a producer on an Emmy-nominated creative documentary on the identity in the American South, which has been featured as an exhibit in the Philadelphia Museum of Modern Art and other cultural institutions. Human rights lawyer Tamar Dekanodze is Equality Now's regional representative in Eurasia. She's an active voice in a movement to ensure women and girls live free from violence and discrimination and ensure they can access justice for sexual and other forms of gender-based violence. She's brought cases of femicide and gender-based violence before the European Court of Human Rights and other UN bureaus. She's also written widely on human rights in patient care, health settings, and gender-based violence. Star Miller is part of Equality Now's development team, where she helps build relationships between individuals and Equality Now's mission and work. She's worked in the field of human rights in programming, advocacy, and development for nearly 10 years, focusing on reproductive rights, bodily autonomy, and violence in several countries, including Nicaragua, South Korea, Burundi, and Rwanda. And once again, everyone, please feel free to put your questions in the chat. We'll try to answer as many as we can during the Q&A. So let's get started. Welcome, Amy, Tamar, and Star. So first, tell us just a little bit about Equality Now and how its mission got started. What really inspired folks to decide to use law to change the world in this way?
Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. Yeah, I can tell you a little bit about Equality Now and how we got started. We are the world's leading expert on using the law to create a safer, a just world for women and girls. And what we do is really work to identify discriminatory laws to build a body of evidence to show how they negatively impact women and girls and push for their repeal. And since 2001, we have helped to repeal or amend over 80 laws. And in 2023 alone, we've worked to repeal 14. In the US, we had 2 states, Michigan and Connecticut, adopt 18 as the minimum age for marriage with no exceptions. And we had 18 successful written submissions and 3 oral statements to treaty bodies creating law and policy reform, which created change for millions of girls and women at a national level.
So let's just look at the problem a little more so we can understand better what you do. I know that the World Bank estimates that women across the world have just 3/4 of the legal rights on men when they sort of put it all together as an average. So give us a feel for the types of legal discrimination you witness, what this really means. We might not think about it until you give us some sense of what kind of discrimination we're talking about.
Sure. So the World Bank estimates that only 14 of 190 economies worldwide have achieved legal gender equality. So the problem is essentially ubiquitous. And at Equality Now, we focus on 4 key areas. The first, ensuring gender equality is enshrined in the law, including making sure that national constitutions explicitly prohibit gender-based discrimination, which is still not the case in the US after 100 years of trying to get the ERA passed. We do this by ensuring laws adequately protect women and girls against sexual violence and provide survivors proper access to justice. We help to strengthen laws to address sexual exploitation, like sex trafficking, and new forms of exploitation in the digital realm. And then also ensuring harmful practices like FGM, child marriage, and bride kidnapping are outlawed. So
our transformation partnerships work on systemic change, and we often say that's sort of their background work. It's the laws and policies. It's not always, sometimes it's helping individual women, but it's often helping change the playing field, if you will, for all women. So just give us a sense of why legal equality is so important for all the rest of this systemic change.
Yeah, I'll jump in there. I think you hit the nail on the head with the name of the very name of these grants that you give out. The reason is, first and foremost, because it is transformational in its impact. We often don't think about this a lot, but a nation's laws govern how the government treats its people and, in effect, really how the people treat each other. And so changing laws can literally rewrite the course of history. It reshapes the future for millions of people, and that's be it for good or bad. And so it's really important for us to work on making sure that it is actually for good. And then I would say the other piece of that is just that it is durable. If our rights and protections aren't enshrined in the law, then we don't have any recourse at all when those rights and protections are threatened. And this leaves women's safety, health, financial health, political inclusion, and just basic human rights subject to the political and cultural winds of change. And so it's really about locking in those changes and ensuring that governments and perpetrators can be held accountable for discrimination and harms against women and girls.
I want to come back to that accountability in just a minute, but could you give a few more maybe specific examples of some of these inequalities? I mean, I think about things like property, or I know divorce laws vary in a lot of countries, that has a huge impact, or the ability to keep a child if there's divorce. So what are some specific examples or countries that you've worked in, or that you're still working on?
Yeah, I mean, I think actually in your previous video, you hit on a couple of them, and you're right when it comes to divorce laws and custody laws. All of that is very true. I mean, I kind of see it in two different buckets, right? There are the on one hand, the laws that just outright discriminate and restrict women's rights, freedoms, and opportunities that men enjoy from the moment literally they're born and gendered as women. And so a couple of these you mentioned, 18 countries have laws that allow husbands to prevent their wives from working. 42 countries prevent daughters from inheriting the same proportion of property and assets and as sons would get. And then 43 countries don't grant widows the same inheritance rights as widowers. 76 countries limit women's property rights, and 86 countries have laws preventing women from working specific jobs based on factors like the time of day that it happens. So you can imagine if that's your lot, if you're in a country with some of these laws, then that prevents millions of women and girls from reaching their full potential and really having full agency over their own lives and their finances. And that leaves them vulnerable. It creates dependency. It leaves them vulnerable to violence and exploitation in their homes and in society and by exploitative jobs, all of these things. And it really also kind of the downstream effects of that impact us all is that it also stands in the way of women being politically influential and leaders in their communities and countries. And, I think we can all agree we need we need more women's leadership. We need more women's influence. And then there's the other side of the coin, besides just the discriminatory laws, there are bad laws, and there are major legal gaps that fail to protect women and girls against the kinds of unique discrimination and threats that they disproportionately face. So, for example, human rights violations like FGM and child marriage are not outlawed in many places, including many US states. And in almost every country, there are gaps and loopholes in sexual violence laws that actually make it more difficult for or I guess I would say easier for perpetrators to evade justice than for survivors to actually get justice. And that includes laws that define rape, use a forced-based definition for rape rather than consent. And that puts the onus and the burden on the survivor to prove that she was forced through physical injuries or witnesses. And at very least, that can be really impractical. And in many, many instances, it can be absolutely humiliating and re-traumatizing. So preventing women from coming out in the first place. And then there are also, places in which marital rape isn't recognized as a crime or as rape. And laws that actually pressure some victims to marry their rapists, because then the case is settled out of court and the perpetrator avoids justice. So collectively, what this does is it creates a culture of impunity, and that it doesn't discourage perpetrators, and that makes women and girls infinitely just less safe in the world. So it's a little bit of both of those things.
So we've identified these problems. Give us a feel for, so what do you do? I mean, I'm thinking, okay, we could list these countries that have some of these laws. How is it that you go? I know you work through local partners, but what approach do you take? Really specifically, walk us through what this would look like after you've identified a problem.
So that's a really good question that has a very long answer. And
give us a sense of it. Give us a sense.
Yeah.
I mean, you're in a country and there's all these laws. Where do you start?
Right. So yeah, I'll just jump in really quickly and talk a little bit about our theory of change here, which is, there are really 4 ways that we pursue legal change and justice for women and girls, which is the first one is this legal pathway, right? Which is we do, we analyze laws worldwide. We identify discriminatory laws. We develop the evidence through women's stories, through statistics, all of these things for how these laws are negatively impacting women and girls. And we work to change them in a variety of ways. And one of the ways that we go about that, especially in the legal pathway, is strategic litigation, which I'm really excited for Tamar to tell you more about. The second way is advocacy, and that is elevating women's voices and stories and the voices of the grassroots to raise awareness and to help create change attitudes and hearts and minds. It is also government engagement in many cases. Some governments are really willing to make some change when they know there's a problem. And so, we provide technical support, we push for legal reforms that are needed and in that government engagement. And sometimes we will take these governments, we will tell on these governments effectively at the international level if they're failing to meet their obligations under an international human rights law. So there are many different ways that we kind of pressure these changes in terms of advocacy. Third is collaboration. We work in partnership with hundreds of organizations from the grassroots to the global level, because really, legal change, it takes a lot of persistence and it takes collective power, and we're not going to go in there and change things alone, and we don't know the context, and we're not always the experts, and so we need local partners to kind of infuse the work with that. And so we build these coalitions and provide capacity building in advocacy, in communications. We accompany survivors and grassroots actors in engaging their own governments and engaging international bodies, so that we're really all working on this together. And then the fourth is a resourcing pathway, which is pushing to make sure that that the good laws and solutions to many of the problems that we see are adequately resourced, that governments are investing the money in this, and there's really resources going to this. And in some cases, we are also supporting some of our grassroots partners so that they can participate and hold campaigns and things like that we know will really help move the needle at the grassroots level for some of, in some of these places where some of these organizations don't have the same resources that we have. So that's really 4 ways, and it can look so different everywhere.
Right. And Tamara, did you want to say something about the strategic litigation? Is this a good time for you to give us a feel for how that would work?
Of course. Hello, everyone. Indeed, strategic litigation is a very important tool that equality now employs to drive systemic and structural change. Strategic litigation involves very carefully selecting cases that do not only impact an individual survivor, but also illustrate systemic and structural injustice that women and girls face in many parts of the world. So with strategic litigation, we take cases first at local level and then at regional and international mechanisms, including UN bodies. And the outcome of these cases has the potential to change the laws, to change the policies, to change the practices, and even social and cultural attitudes about certain issues relating with the rights of women and girls. And let me give you 2 examples to illustrate our work of strategic litigation. These are our ongoing cases in Georgia and Kyrgyzstan. The case in Kyrgyzstan involves a girl with disabilities who lived in a village, and she was systematically raped by her uncle and her grandfather. And she never received justice. And the reason that Aselia never received justice, and she was raped while she was still a minor, was that the laws, procedures, and policies in Kyrgyzstan do not respond to the needs of women and girls with disabilities. There are laws in place and there are practices in place that deny survivors of sexual violence who have a disability to act as witnesses in their own cases. And the evidentiary standards, like the standard of evidence required by the justice system, is so high that women and girls with disabilities, it's almost impossible for them to meet. These were the reasons why Aselia never received justice in Kyrgyzstan. And now we are on a final appeal at the local level in Kyrgyzstan at national courts, and then we are taking the case to the United Nations. And if our case is successful, the UN will urge the government of Kyrgyzstan to change its laws, to change its policies, and to change its procedures, not only to ensure justice for Aselia, but to ensure justice for women and girls who are in the same condition. Girls with disabilities, survivors of sexual violence who never received justice, and to make sure that the criminal justice system locally is well equipped to handle such cases in the future. So this case had the potential to set an important global standard about how authorities and local actors have to treat women and girls with disabilities to ensure justice for them. And another case that we are litigating at the moment at the European Court of Human Rights, together with our partners EHRAC and Gayla, concerns the right of a survivor of sexual violence and harassment to speak about her experiences. What happened in Georgia was that the survivor of sexual harassment very bravely went on television and spoke about the harassment she experienced. And the fact of sexual harassment was already established by an authorized body in Georgia. So it was not a disputed fact that she actually was subjected to this abuse. However, her perpetrator took this case to the court and sued her for defamation, and he won the case in all 3 instances of national courts in Georgia. That's why, together with partners, we took the case to the European Court of Human Rights. And surprisingly enough, even though this is a very widespread issue and increasingly problematic issue facing women worldwide, the European Court has never ever heard such a case before. So while hearing this case and deciding on this case, the European Court will set an important standard Europe-wide about how to ensure that survivors of sexual violence and harassment are free to express and share their experiences. And this Europe-wide standard could also help shaping global standards, as this is an increasingly problematic systemic issue that we see in many different parts of the world.
And all of these you work through local lawyers, I'm assuming, or local legal organizations?
Of course, we are working in close partnership with local legal organizations in Georgia and in Kyrgyzstan. And also we have a partner based in London, EHRAC.
Very interesting. So with all these different countries, can you tell us a little bit more about some of the countries that you really are focused on? Many of our members have seen featured grants in many different countries. So you want to zero in on either your country that you have perhaps a long history in, or maybe you're looking at working in for the first time?
Well, we are increasingly working in the Caucasus and Central Asia at the moment. In Caucasus, Georgia, Armenia, and also we're starting to work in Azerbaijan and Central Asian countries, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan. Working in these countries is strategically very important for us because there are quite a few openings for us to engage and affect systemic change. For example, the fact that some of these countries aspire joining the European Union and put in place legal reforms. Now is a very good time for us to be there to support the local groups, to support the government authorities in making sure that right laws are put in place to protect women and ensure gender equality and combat these widespread abuses, which have been systematically overlooked in the region over decades.
If I could just brag on
Sure.
Tamar for just one more second, the work that she has been doing in Georgia, both on these cases, but also much of the other work and in previous cases, and also in training justice system officials how to apply human rights law and in addressing sexual violence crimes has had a extraordinarily transformational impact in Georgia. in 1 year's time, after Tamar and some of our partners trained 500 justice system officials, it increased prosecution rates by over 70% and conviction rates by over 50% in sexual violence crimes 1 year alone across the country. And to the point that she was just making about many of these governments are now willing to look at this because they want EU candidacy.
Sure.
Very recently, Georgia was granted candidate status to the EU, which is a major move. And whenever they delivered this news, that one of the reasons they cited was actually Georgia's efforts to address violence against and sexual violence against women and girls. So a very, very direct result of the work that Tamar was doing.
Interesting, but I want to go back to one thing you just mentioned. I think it was training members of the judiciary or something. How do you work? I mean, we all know there's laws that might be in place, which then, are not put into practice or just either ignored, or the people in the judiciary don't have the skills or resources. I mean, you must get involved in some of those areas as well, right?
Yes, exactly. This is the situation we've been facing in Georgia and other countries of the region. In Georgia, sexual violence crimes have been defined and procedures and practices that have been in place dated back to the period of the Soviet Union. And throughout the years, they were never updated. And criminal justice actors have been applying extremely discriminatory and old era and outdated approaches on how to investigate and prosecute sexual violence crimes, which denied access to justice to survivors. So the laws were bad, and implementation of these laws was even more disappointing. What we did in Georgia to resolve this was that we partnered with Council of European Women and Georgian authorities and other local groups, and we created the first manual of its kind on sexual violence procedures. And this is a practical guidance to criminal justice actors about how to handle sexual violence cases in line with international human rights standards. And then, based on this manual, we trained, as Amy mentioned, investigators, prosecutors, and judges, and this work has resulted in extraordinary increase in access to justice for sexual violence in Georgia. And now we're replicating this work in other parts of the world. For example, in Kyrgyzstan, we are now doing the similar manual, but with specific focus on women and girls with disabilities.
Every country is different, but are there practices or perhaps manuals like that can carry over from one country to another? I mean, do you have some sort of efficiencies, I guess I would say, from that expertise?
Yes, exactly. For example, the countries of the former Soviet Union, 15 countries of the former Soviet Union, are very similar in ways how their laws are framed and how their laws are implemented. The definition of rape is very similar throughout these countries. It's based on force in almost all the countries still, and not based on the lack of consent. And the evidence required to prove rape it's a very, very high threshold, which is also very common throughout these countries. Examining hymen of a victim, like so-called virginity tests to prove rape, is also very prevalent. And a very problematic practice, which is still in place in many countries of the region, is private and private-public prosecutions, which means that the burden to prosecute the perpetrator is not on the prosecutor, it's on the victim. The victim carried the burden to bring charges against the perpetrator, collect evidence, and ensure justice for herself, which is completely impossible in most of the cases, obviously, because of the seriousness and impact of sexual violence that and trauma that victims experience.
Yeah, and just to say, regionally, a manual like the one that Tamar and our colleagues created and partners created, it is regionally specific, right? Because you go to Latin America and a lot of the laws are different, but in the same way, there are similarly laws that reappear in Latin American countries that pose entirely different challenges and problems. And so we are also have people that are experts on the law in Latin America, and specifically how these cases are tried and at what points along the way there are barriers to justice. And sometimes that results in training. Sometimes it results in, the strategic litigation cases that really crack open the problem. And similarly, and then in Africa, so it's same thing, different laws, different systems, different problems. And so that's part of the important work of both having locally rooted staff, but deep local partnerships, because that really helps inform our analysis of these things, and track the real challenges, and then figure out what is the fix there that needs to happen.
Absolutely. As I listen to some of this work, and especially something like the strategic litigation, I find myself thinking, this is not done overnight. So give us an idea of how to think about the timing. I mean, I feel like some of these cases in something like the European Union must be years in the making, much less more. So how do you think about that time frame?
Well, that's indeed a very time-consuming process. Litigating cases at UN mechanisms and at regional courts can take years. It can take from 2 years up to 5 and 6 years, and some cases even take longer. Despite this, I find doing strategic litigation extremely impactful because, and we have seen this also many times in Georgia, the impact of the case can start right after the authorities find out that the case was submitted to an international or a regional body. There are very few governments who are happy when they are sued, and there are very few governments who would like to lose the case at the international or regional bodies. And what we have seen in my region and in Georgia and also some other countries of Eurasia was that right after the submission of the case to the European Court or an UN mechanism, the authorities started putting in place those reforms that were highlighted as deficiencies, as systemic failures in the applications. And for example, with the femicide cases that we litigated in Georgia, and we got the judgments like last year, and we submitted the cases 5 and 6 years ago. The issues we had highlighted like several years ago, many of those had already been resolved by the time that when we received the decision. So strategic litigation, even though it's time consuming, it's still a very important and powerful tool because it indeed puts significant pressure on the authorities right after the submission of the case to these mechanisms, human rights mechanisms.
Sure. So when I think about these kind of background, legal changes, I'm wondering how you measure what kind of progress or impact you make. I mean, I can imagine you can measure, if a law is changed or you win a case or you train judges, but how do you really, is there any way to really get at some of that longer term societal change? I mean, that's got to be a tough one.
Yeah, I can tackle that one.
I don't know what the perfect solution is, but that's an interesting thing to try to pull out what data you might look at to really see where an impact is being made.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we count submissions to UN treaty bodies. We count, like you said, laws that we've helped change, new commitments and champions in governments, whether we're delivering what's really needed to the field, and how many grassroots organizations we've worked with and strengthened through trainings, and to the extent that we can, what impact they're having in their communities and countries. And then, what it comes down to is if good laws are in place and we see that they're not working, then we focus on how they're being implemented. And then within our organization, we have annual reflection conversations with our teams, bringing them together to discuss the work, to assess progress, to assess challenges and opportunities, and to see if something's not working, then we're able to consult staff, to consult partners in other parts of the world and ask them what's worked for them and use that to inform changes to our approach.
Is it difficult to decide which issues to focus on first? I mean, I think of some of these problems, what does that conversation look like?
Yeah. So our 4 thematic areas reflect the issues that we think are the most urgent and detrimental to women and girls. And so from there, we focus on where we have expertise, especially unique expertise, on locations where we have strong partnerships and access to decision makers, and where we think we can actually move the needle, and what will have the widest and most far-reaching impact.
So we're going to take questions in just a few moments. If you have them, put them in the chat. But I'm curious as to if you see any, I guess I would say, big issues coming up in the next few years, either that you as an organization are pursuing, or perhaps, what's bubbling up in the countries you work in. What sort of trends or changes might we see in the next year or a couple of years?
Yeah, absolutely. Gosh, there's so much going on in the world, right? So many problems to tackle right now. I mean, for Equality Now, especially right now, the work in Latin America is really blowing up because we won that giant case in Bolivia at the beginning of January, and it's set at the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and it basically set legal precedent that every country in Latin America can be held to. So what's
Could
happening
you just
now?
refresh us? Some of our members might not be familiar with that
Yep.
case. If there's like a
Sorry.
30-second version.
Yes, we were representing a survivor of adolescent sexual violence who was denied justice 3 times in Bolivia. We helped take her court to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights and accusing Bolivia of failing to uphold her human rights and provide adequate access to justice. 10 years later, 10 years later, after all of this, which included many things and steps along the way, the courts ruled in favor of the survivor in this case, forcing Bolivia to change up its rape laws, forcing them to retrain and reassess the whole process for how they investigate and adjudicate these crimes, taking many problematic clauses off the books, forcing public apologies, like really significant verdict here. And it basically put a lot of governments across Latin America on notice that this could happen. And so civil society and governments alike are coming to us to say, what do we need to do? How do we get in front of this? Or how do we push our governments to comply with this, et cetera? So that's really blowing up. And, we've got things kind of happening in Guatemala, Brazil, Mexico, Argentina as a result of that. So that's one of the pieces. And then I think the work in Eurasia and this work around really supporting survivors with disabilities. Another case we're working in Guatemala is a little different situation, forced pregnancy, then forced sterilization after being pregnant as a result of a sexual assault. And so that is really exciting work and really critical and important work. And then there is this whole new realm where women are increasingly facing abuses and exploitations, and that is the digital world. And in terms of lawmaking in the digital world, it is like the Wild West. Governments can't keep pace with the technology, and this is a borderless area, right? So governments, so is it where the company is that has a platform that's allowing for this, is a perpetrator? And so it really requires a global collaboration and global solutions to this issue. And then also just governments need guidance as well to address things like deepfake imagery, as we've seen with the Taylor Swift case that's going around right now, tech facilitated violence and trafficking, and even just gender bias in AI. Because if our data sets are gender biased, then the AI that's using those data sets will be too. And so it's just replicating it, right? And so there's just so much there. It requires urgent lawmaking. It requires, a global solution. And one of the things that we're doing is we are making sure these discussions about global agreements for how to tackle this issue have a gender lens to them, because in so many ways, if there aren't women in the room discussing the problems, then a lot of the solutions kind of leave women off the table. And then there's just the other piece where we're working with the Organization of American States and other partners to develop a model law on addressing tech facilitated violence that can be first of its kind used in Latin America. And we've already gotten the Brazilian government interested in being the one to launch this. And then that's something, and it's actually based on the kinds of model laws and solutions that we've seen in other parts of the world. So this is going to be the new horizon in a lot of ways.
That's fascinating. And thank you for taking that one on. We know, though, also the tech industry, no small connection here. The tech industry is one of the most overwhelmingly male industries that we still have left all over. So that's going to be a very interesting one. Wendy, I think we have a lot of questions probably. Do you want to get started with that, or I can
Sure.
happily keep talking, but I don't know if you want to get to the questions.
Well, let's get to some of the audience questions. So there's a question about the lawyers that you work with. Do you work with or partner with volunteer lawyers? I would imagine there might be people around the world that want to step up and support you in your work.
Lauren, you want to jump in on that?
Yes, of course. With litigating cases, we mostly partner with lawyers who work with civil society organizations, non-governmental organizations locally, and who have direct access and direct contact with survivors. And they litigate the case at the local level with our support, because they are locally trained and locally qualified lawyers. So their involvement in the case is absolutely crucial, since they have the authority, they have the right to practice law locally in these countries. And they are our key partners. But we are also very happy to collaborate with other human rights lawyers and groups that are not based in the countries we are focusing on. And we are doing this with drafting third-party interventions and amicus briefs, which helps the regional and international bodies to elaborate on the issues that we are litigating about. For example, we might be litigating a case in Georgia, but we might have we might have volunteer lawyers or groups or organizations in other countries who do assessment to kind of an analysis of the issues that we are raising in our complaint, and we're attaching then this brief to our application, which helps the court to decide the case. So any kind of collaboration which can bring together different voices and expertise from around the world to support a case in a specific country is more than welcome. And if anybody is listening to us who's willing to collaborate, please reach out.
That's awesome. There's been a couple of questions now, and it kind of leads into what you just talked about. How many people actually work for equality now versus, all these other organizations that you partner with?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I want to say things change. I would say probably in the area of about 60, 70 people. And I think that is, I think we have staff in 12 to 15 countries around the world, and with some major kind of regional operations, especially in Kenya and in Lebanon, and here in the US, UK, and certainly just pockets in Eurasia, etc.
So clearly you really rely on those local partners, because a staff of 60 or maybe a bit more all around the world is pretty small.
Yeah, we're spread pretty thin. And there are lots of problems and lots of places where there's a need, and we can just replicate our impact, and actually not just expand our impact, but strengthen the ability of local actors to know how to pursue legal reforms. I mean, the strategic litigation is just one tool in the toolbox, but there are local advocates that can actually push in many different ways for legal reforms. And so as long as we are giving them the expertise and the knowledge we have and recommendations on how it's done in other places and actually accompanying them in the work of engaging governments, then we are actually creating more people that can do this work.
Are these local groups of lawyers or human rights groups or women's rights groups, or what kind of groups are they? Does it?
I'm tempted. I would say it's a lot. Survivor groups,
Okay.
and women's rights organizations. But Tamar, I know that you're working a lot with various groups. So maybe you want to explain in Georgia and throughout the region.
Yes, as you said, these are survivor groups. These are lawyers. These are professionals who work on gender issues. These are sometimes groups of students. These are community organizations that focus on specific issues like the issues of disability, the issues of minoritized communities, the issues of like adolescents, and sometimes they are also healthcare professionals and forensic experts that also provide a lot of support to our work, as issues of sexual violence and child marriage are not purely legal issues. They are interlinked with the involvement of professionals whose expertise goes beyond legal expertise is also extremely crucial. So these are wide range of professionals and groups, and we also partner with local media and media organizations. For example, in Uzbekistan, we have done trainings with media organizations and journalists to make sure that our messages, our campaign messages in Uzbekistan are rightly framed, and local journalists are very well equipped with the skills of reporting on extremely sensitive issue of sexual violence and other women's rights violations. And they are also not only people we train, they are partners of us while implementing our activities.
Great. It's a question about, are you working on any cases or challenges here in the US?
We don't have any strategic litigation cases in the United States at the moment. Certainly one of the big things we're working for here is the ERA. We really need that constitutional guarantee of gender equality, and we are in really bad company in terms of countries around the world who are not providing. A handful of countries, I want to say it's only 5 or 7. I think we might be the only democracy without constitutional guarantees of gender equality. And so that's really a big one because it's such a foundational element. But also, FGM is still not outlawed in 10 states. Child marriage is still legal. There have been a couple changes recently. I want to say 40. It was 40 at the beginning of last year, but a couple things changed. But in most of the country, 18 is not the minimum age for marriage. We're actually doing an investigative report right now on the prevalence and incidences of FGM in the United States amongst communities that are not immigrant communities, that are, the unsuspected kind of cases. And then as everybody I'm sure knows, I mean, sexual violence is definitely a very real issue, and that's something that we're working to get more involved in. But we did help advocate, for example, for the Adult Survivors Act, which is what allowed cases like E. Jean Carroll's to go into civil courts, even though it was past the statute of limitations. And so some of that stuff, and really just elevating the issues. I think, there's actually not an issue that we're talking about in other parts of the world that isn't an issue here. And that's a real big misconception.
Absolutely. Just one last thing. There was a question in the chat, but I'll turn it into more of a pitch for you guys. Your website has a ton of valuable information, fact sheets and manuals and whatnot. I really encourage people to check it out. It's in the chat, but it's also very simple, equalitynow.org, I believe. Yep, equalitynow.org. Likewise, on the Together Women Rise site, where we have our fact sheet for the grant we're featuring. You can read more about the story that Amy was telling you about Bolivia, which I put in the chat, that does involve one of our past grantees, a Breeze of Hope Foundation. And it is the story of Brisa de Angelo that you all heard about when we featured that grantee. So please read more about that and you know, the excellent work that Equality did now with her. I think that's all our questions, Scott. So I'll turn it back to you to wrap up with some final announcements.
And I'm glad we ended on a little bit of a positive note, or at least an accomplishment, because that's wonderful. And I'm sure you have so many actually statements of progress that you've made. So thank you. Thank you for joining us tonight, Amy, Tamar Star. Thank you for all of your time and answering our questions. We are so very pleased to support your work. It's so very important for all of us and for our mission and for the women and girls around the globe. So before everyone leaves tonight, let me just tell you a couple of things that are coming up for Together Women Rise. Watch for a special email in the middle of February, because that is the announcement of our 2024 featured grantees. And in addition, there's a couple of trips coming up in 2024. Registration is open for the Guatemala trip in April and the Cambodia trip in November. The deadline for the Guatemala trip has been extended to March 1st, but please do not wait if you're interested. There's a few limited spots remaining, and that will be a great one. There's also a trip to Malawi coming up. This was originally planned for June, but now is moving to October. So that gives you time to plan and register. So that's Guatemala, Cambodia, and Malawi to look at. So look at your calendars. Our advocacy group with results holds its monthly webinar Tuesday, February 20th at 8:30 Eastern, 5:30 Pacific. In that, you can learn more about how to really be an advocate and make a bigger impact. And some people I know find that phenomenally satisfying, and it's very important work. Our next monthly webinar is Thursday, March 7th at the same time, 8 Eastern, 5 Pacific, and we will be celebrating International Women's Day at the same event. So check out our upcoming events at the Join Us tab on the website and go to upcoming events. You will be able to learn more and register, and also see recordings of past events. If other people want to hear about it, the recordings are there. Thank you all very much, and good night.